Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Library, where history whispers its stories in the gentlest voice. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Whether you're settling into bed, curled up in a cozy corner, or simply seeking a peaceful moment in your day, you've come to the right place. This is our quiet sanctuary where the past comes alive through slow, calming narratives designed to ease your mind and help you drift into restful sleep. Tonight, we'll journey together through forgotten worlds and meet the people whose patient hands created beauty that has lasted for centuries. Before we begin, I'd love to invite you to become part of our growing community. If these gentle historical tales bring you comfort, please consider subscribing. It helps us reach others who might need this same peaceful refuge. And if tonight's story resonates with you, a quiet like would mean the world. I'm always curious about our listeners. Where are you joining us from tonight? Are you listening from your bedroom? Perhaps while rain patters against your window? Or maybe you're traveling, finding comfort in a familiar voice in an unfamiliar place. And when do you usually visit us? Is this part of your evening routine? Or do you find these stories helpful during afternoon quiet moments? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories about where and when you listen help create the warm, connected community that makes the Sleep Library so special. Now, let's dim the lights, settle in comfortably, and let tonight's gentle tale begin. In the quiet halls of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, where stone walls have witnessed centuries pass like gentle whispers, there once lived men whose lives were devoted to an art form that required infinite patience. These were the Manuscript Illuminators, monks whose steady hands transformed blank parchment into windows of divine beauty, one careful brushstroke at a time. Tonight, we journey back to the 12th century, to a world where time moved differently, where the scratch of quill on parchment and the soft grinding of pigments marked the rhythm of days. Here, in this ancient abbey, dedicated brothers spent their lives creating illuminated manuscripts that would outlive empires, their work continuing in an unbroken chain of devotion that stretched across generations. The Abbey of Saint-Denis holds a special place in French history, not only as the burial place of kings, but as one of Europe's great centers of learning and artistic creation. Within its scriptoriums, the art of manuscript illumination reached heights that still inspire wonder today. But this is not a story of dramatic achievements or sudden revelations. Instead, it is the gentle tale of daily devotion, of countless hours spent in quiet concentration, of the slow accumulation of beauty created by human hands, guided by faith and tradition. As we explore this world together, imagine the soft light filtering through tall windows, the whisper of turning pages, the comfortable silence broken only by the distant chanting of prayers. This is a story that unfolds like the manuscripts themselves, slowly, deliberately, with each detail carefully considered and lovingly placed. The morning mist clings to the stones of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, as it has for centuries, creating an ethereal veil over walls that have witnessed the quiet devotion of countless generations. Founded in the 7th century over the burial place of Saint-Denis, the legendary first bishop of Paris, this abbey would grow to become not merely a place of worship, but a sanctuary where art, learning and spirituality converged in perfect harmony. In the year 1140, as the great Gothic cathedral began to rise under the visionary guidance of Abbot Suger, the monastery's scriptorium was already renowned throughout Christendom. Here, within chambers specifically designed for the creation of sacred texts, monks dedicated their lives to the meticulous art of manuscript illumination. The very stones seemed to breathe with centuries of accumulated prayer and patient labor. The scriptorium of Saint-Denis occupied the eastern wing of the monastery complex, positioned to capture the gentle morning light that was so essential to the illuminator's work. These rooms were not grand halls, but modest chambers, each designed with the understanding that the creation of sacred art required both comfort and concentration. The walls, built thick to maintain steady temperatures, were pierced by carefully positioned windows that allowed natural light to flood the working surfaces while protecting the precious materials from direct sunlight that might fade the delicate pigments. Brother Thomas, a fictional but representative figure of the many illuminators who worked within these walls, might have begun his day at the abbey much like his predecessors had for generations before him. Rising before dawn for the first prayers of the day, he would make his way through corridors lit by flickering candles. The stone floors were smoothed by countless sandaled feet. The ritual of communal prayer, with its rhythmic chanting and measured responses, prepared the mind for the meditative work that lay ahead. After the morning meal, a simple affair of bread, ale, and perhaps some cheese, Brother Thomas would enter the scriptorium as the first pale light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern windows. The room held a special quality in these early hours, when the air was still cool and fresh, and the day's work lay ahead like an unwritten page. The long wooden tables, polished smooth by years of use, stood ready with their carefully arranged tools and materials. The atmosphere of the scriptorium was one of profound reverence. This was not merely a workplace, but a sacred space where earthly craft served heavenly purpose. Each illuminator understood that his work was a form of prayer, a way of honoring God through the creation of beauty that would inspire devotion in others. The silence was not empty, but full, pregnant with concentration, dedication, and the accumulated spiritual energy of generations of devoted craftsmen. The daily routine followed patterns established over centuries. Morning hours were reserved for the finest work, when eyes were fresh and hands were steady. The soft scratch of quills on parchment, the gentle tapping of brushes against palette edges, and the occasional whisper of consultation between monks created a subtle symphony of productivity. These sounds, so different from the noise of the outside world, became the background music of creation. The tools of the illuminator were simple yet sophisticated, each one representing centuries of refinement and adaptation. Quills, carefully selected and prepared, served as both pen and brush. Pigments, ground from minerals, plants, and even precious metals, offered a palette that could capture the full spectrum of divine beauty. Parchment, prepared from the finest calfskin, provided a surface smooth enough to accept the most delicate details, yet durable enough to preserve the work for centuries. But perhaps most important was the atmosphere of patience that permeated the scriptorium. In an age when most of life moved at the pace of walking, when travel was measured in days rather than hours, the illuminators had learned to find satisfaction in the gradual accumulation of beauty. A single page might require weeks to complete, with layers of text, decoration, and illustration building slowly upon one another like the growth rings of an ancient tree. The spiritual dimension of their work was never far from the illuminators' minds. Each manuscript was not merely a book, but a vessel for sacred knowledge, a means of preserving and transmitting the wisdom of the Church to future generations. The act of illumination was understood as a collaboration with the divine, a way of making visible the invisible truths of faith. In the gentle curves of decorative letters, the illuminators saw reflections of the harmony of creation. In the careful balance of colors, they found expressions of the divine order that governed all existence. The scriptorium also served as a training ground for the next generation of illuminators. Young novices would begin their artistic education by grinding pigments and preparing parchment, gradually working their way up to simple decorative elements, before being entrusted with more complex compositions. This system ensured that the traditions and techniques developed over centuries would be passed down intact, each generation adding its own subtle refinements while maintaining the essential character of the abbey's distinctive style. As the morning light strengthened and filled the scriptorium with its golden warmth, the illuminators would settle into their work with the contentment of men who had found their calling. Each knew that the pages they created would outlive them, carrying their devotion and skill forward into an uncertain future. In this knowledge lay both humility and satisfaction, the understanding that their individual contributions were small parts of a greater whole, yet essential to the preservation of beauty and wisdom in a world that often seemed chaotic and threatening. The rhythm of monastery life provided structure and meaning to their days. The bells that called the community to prayer also marked the natural divisions of the working day, reminding the illuminators that their craft existed within the larger context of spiritual devotion. As morning gave way to afternoon, and afternoon to evening, the cycle of prayer and work continued, each day adding another small increment to the accumulated treasure of illuminated wisdom. In the pale-dawn darkness of the scriptorium, before the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern windows, the day's work began not with brush and pigment, but with the patient preparation of materials that would serve as the foundation for beauty. The illuminators of Saint-Denis understood that the most exquisite artistry could only flourish upon a foundation of meticulous preparation, and so they devoted countless hours to the careful creation of the basic elements of their craft. Brother Thomas moved through the preparation chamber with the measured pace of long practice, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor. The room itself was a marvel of practical organization, with shelves and cabinets arranged to hold the myriad materials required for manuscript creation. Here, the raw substances of the earth would be transformed into the refined materials of artistic expression, each step in the process carried out with the same reverence accorded to the most sacred rituals. The preparation of parchment was perhaps the most fundamental skill, one that required both technical knowledge and an almost mystical understanding of the material's nature. The finest manuscripts demanded the finest writing surface, and the monks of Saint-Denis had perfected techniques for creating parchment of extraordinary quality. Calfskin, selected for its smoothness and durability, arrived at the monastery from carefully chosen sources, each hide inspected for flaws that might compromise the finished product. The process of transforming raw hide into pristine parchment unfolded over many days, each step requiring patient attention to detail. First, the hide would be soaked in cool, clean water to soften the fibers and remove any traces of blood or debris. This soaking, carried out in specially constructed stone basins, might continue for several days, with the water changed regularly to ensure purity. The monks understood that haste at this stage would compromise everything that followed, so they allowed time for the hide to reach the proper state of suppleness. After soaking came the delicate process of hair removal, using specially designed tools that had been refined over generations. The monks would carefully scrape away every trace of hair and flesh, working with gentle, consistent strokes that cleaned the surface without damaging the underlying structure. This work required considerable skill, as too much pressure might create thin spots or holes that would render the parchment useless for fine work, while too little would leave imperfections that would interfere with the smooth flow of ink and pigment. The scraped hide was then stretched on wooden frames, held taut by a carefully calibrated tension that would allow it to dry evenly without warping or developing weak spots. As it dried, usually over the course of several days depending on weather conditions, the monks would periodically adjust the tension and continue the scraping process, gradually achieving the smooth, even surface that would receive their artistry. The sound of scraping was rhythmic and meditative, a gentle scratching that became part of the scriptorium's daily symphony. Once properly dried and scraped, the parchment received its final preparation through a process of careful sanding and burnishing. Using fine abrasives made from pulverized stone, the illuminators would smooth away the last imperfections, creating a surface so refined that it seemed to glow within a light. The burnishing process, carried out with smooth stones or specially prepared pones, compressed the fibers and created a surface that would accept ink cleanly while resisting the bleeding that could ruin delicate work. Parallel to the preparation of parchment was the equally important task of creating the pigments that would bring the manuscripts to life. The Abbey's pigment preparation area was a wonderland of colors in their raw form: chunks of mineral, dried insects, exotic plants, and precious metals that would be transformed into the brilliant hues that illuminated the sacred texts. Each color had its own requirements, its own process of preparation that had been refined through centuries of experimentation and tradition. The most precious of all pigments was ultramarine, created from lapis lazuli imported at great expense from distant Afghanistan. The preparation of ultramarine was a process that could take weeks, beginning with the careful crushing of the precious stone. The illuminators used special mortars made from agate or other hard stones, grinding the lapis lazuli by hand with a circular motion that gradually reduced the crystalline structure to fine powder. The sound of grinding was almost musical, a subtle percussion that marked the slow transformation of mineral into pigment. But crushing was only the beginning. The ground lapis lazuli had to be purified through a complex process that separated the brilliant blue particles from the colorless binding matrix. This was accomplished through a technique that combined chemistry with artistry, using specially prepared mixtures of resins, oils, and waxes to extract the blue color in its purest form. The process required patience, as each stage of purification might take days to complete, but the result was a blue of such intensity and clarity that it seemed to capture fragments of heaven itself. Other pigments required different approaches, each presenting its own challenges and rewards. Vermilion, that brilliant red that would grace the robes of saints and the decorative borders of important texts, was created from cinnabar through a process of careful heating and cooling that transformed the mineral's natural form into the desired pigment. The preparation required precise control of temperature, achieved through techniques that had been passed down through generations of alchemists and artists. Gold, the most precious of all manuscript decorations, arrived at the monastery in various forms, sometimes as leaf beaten to incredible thinness, sometimes as powder that would be mixed with binding agents to create paint. The preparation of gold for manuscript work was a ritual in itself, carried out with special tools that were never used for other purposes. The monks understood that gold was not merely decorative, but symbolic, representing divine light and eternal value. The creation of binding agents was equally important to the illuminators' art. Gum arabic, derived from acacia trees, provided the medium that would hold pigments in suspension while allowing them to flow smoothly from brush to parchment. The preparation of gum arabic required careful dissolution in pure water, followed by straining through fine cloth to remove impurities that might interfere with the paint's performance. The resulting medium was clear and slightly sticky, with just the right consistency to carry pigments without overwhelming their natural properties. Egg white, another important binding agent, was prepared fresh as needed, carefully separated from the yolk and beaten to the proper consistency. The illuminators had learned through long experience exactly how to prepare egg white for different purposes: lighter for delicate washes of color, heavier for opaque applications that needed to cover underlying work completely. Even the water used in the scriptorium received special attention. The monks maintained their own wells, carefully positioned to tap into the purest sources, and the water was often filtered through sand and charcoal to remove impurities that might affect the quality of their work. They understood that every element in the chain of creation mattered, that the purity of water was as important as the quality of gold. The preparation of brushes was an art in itself, requiring careful selection and treatment of the finest animal hairs. Sable brushes, prized for their ability to hold pigment while maintaining a sharp point, were crafted individually, with each brush tested and refined until it met the exacting standards of the scriptorium. The illuminators often made their own brushes, selecting individual hairs and binding them with techniques that ensured both durability and precision. As morning light gradually filled the preparation chamber, the illuminators would complete their preliminary tasks with the satisfaction of craftsmen who understood the importance of proper foundations. Each batch of pigment, each sheet of parchment, each carefully prepared brush represented hours of patient labor. But they knew that this preparation was essential to the creation of work that would endure for centuries. The gentle sounds of preparation, the grinding of pigments, the scraping of parchment, the soft whisper of brushes being shaped created a meditative atmosphere that prepared both materials and minds for the artistic work that would follow. In this careful attention to fundamentals, the illuminators found a reflection of monastic life itself, where the most profound spiritual achievements grew from the patient cultivation of basic disciplines. As the morning sun climbed higher above the walls of Saint-Denis, casting long rectangles of golden light across the scriptorium floor, the illuminators settled into their sacred space of creation. The scriptorium was more than merely a workplace. It was a carefully designed environment where every element served to support the delicate work of manuscript illumination, where architecture, light, and human purpose converged in perfect harmony. The scriptorium of Saint-Denis represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about the requirements of artistic creation. The room's proportions had been calculated not through mathematical formulas, but through generations of experience, each dimension refined to serve the particular needs of illuminators. The ceiling rose high enough to prevent the feeling of confinement that might disturb concentration, yet low enough to maintain the intimate atmosphere that fostered careful work. The walls, built of carefully selected stone, absorbed sound and maintained steady temperatures that protected both the manuscripts and their creators from the extremes of weather. Brother Thomas took his accustomed place at one of the long oak tables that dominated the center of the room. These tables, worn smooth by centuries of use, had been positioned to take maximum advantage of the northern light that flowed through the scriptorium's tall windows. Northern exposure was preferred because it provided steady, even illumination throughout the day, without the harsh glare of direct sunlight that could fatigue the eyes and fade delicate pigments. The light that filled the scriptorium was soft and diffused, filtered through oiled parchment or, in later years, clear glass that had been carefully selected for its clarity and lack of distortion. Each illuminator's workspace was a marvel of organization, with every tool and material positioned for maximum efficiency and comfort. To the right of Brother Thomas's writing surface stood a small cabinet with numerous shallow drawers, each containing different pigments in their prepared form. The drawers were labeled with symbols rather than words, as many of the lay brothers who assisted in the scriptorium could not read, but had learned to recognize the visual codes that identified each color. The arrangement followed a logical pattern, with related colors grouped together, and the most frequently used pigments placed within easy reach. The writing surface itself was slightly inclined, supported by an adjustable rest that could be positioned to reduce strain on the illuminator's neck and shoulders. This attention to physical comfort was not mere luxury, but practical necessity, as the creation of illuminated manuscripts required hours of concentrated work in positions that could easily cause fatigue or injury. The angle of the writing surface was critical, steep enough to provide a clear view of the work while preventing ink and paint from pooling incorrectly. To the left of each workspace stood a smaller table holding the illuminator's personal collection of brushes, quills, and other tools. These implements were arranged with the precision of surgical instruments, each in its designated place, so that it could be located without taking attention away from the work at hand. The brushes were sorted by size and type, from the finest sable hairs used for the most delicate details to broader brushes employed for larger areas of color. Each brush was kept in peak condition, cleaned immediately after use, and stored in a way that preserved the shape of its tip. The quills used for both writing and fine illustration work were prepared according to methods that had been refined over centuries. The primary flight feathers of geese provided the best writing instruments. their hollow structure and natural flexibility making them ideal for controlling the flow of ink. The preparation of quills was a skill in itself, requiring careful selection, proper curing, and precise cutting to create the desired writing characteristics. Each illuminator maintained a collection of quills cut for different purposes, some for broad strokes, others for fine lines, each one shaped to perform specific functions within the complex art of manuscript creation. The ink used for text was typically a rich black made from iron gall, a substance created by combining iron sulfate with tannic acid extracted from oak galls. The preparation of this ink was both chemistry and art, requiring precise proportions and careful aging to develop the deep, permanent black that would remain legible for centuries. The ink was stored in specially designed containers that protected it from evaporation, while allowing easy access during long hours of writing. Lighting in the scriptorium required careful management throughout the day. During the prime morning hours, when natural light was at its best, the illuminators worked on their most challenging tasks to find details that required perfect color perception and steady hands. As the day progressed and natural light began to fade, they would transition to tasks that could be accomplished under artificial illumination. Candles made from the finest beeswax provided clean burning light that did not produce the smoke and soot that might damage delicate manuscripts. The candles themselves were works of art, created by the monastery's own candle makers who understood the special requirements of scriptorium work. They burned with steady flames that produced minimal flicker, mounted in specially designed holders that could be adjusted to direct light precisely where it was needed. The warm glow of candlelight created an atmosphere of intimacy and concentration, transforming the scriptorium into a space apart from the ordinary world. Temperature control was another crucial element in the scriptorium's design. The thick stone walls provided natural insulation, moderating the extremes of heat and cold that could make fine work impossible. In winter, carefully tended braziers provided additional warmth without the smoke and drafts that would have made open fires unsuitable. The heat was distributed evenly through a system of flues built into the walls, ensuring that no workspace was too cold for comfortable work while avoiding the excessive heat that might affect the behavior of inks and pigments. Humidity was managed through techniques that seemed almost magical to outside observers. Bowls of water were strategically placed around the room to prevent the air from becoming too dry, which could cause parchment to become brittle and crack. During periods of high humidity, materials that naturally absorbed moisture were employed to prevent the dampness that could cause inks to run or pigments to behave unpredictably. The acoustic properties of the scriptorium had been carefully considered as well. The room's shape and the materials used in its construction combined to create an environment where sounds were softened and muffled, preventing the harsh echoes that might disturb concentration. The gentle sounds of work, the scratch of quills, the soft tapping of brushes, the whisper of turning pages blended into a subtle symphony that actually enhanced focus rather than disturbing it. Storage within the scriptorium was organized according to principles that protected both completed work and materials in process. Completed manuscripts were kept in specially constructed cabinets with careful attention to air circulation and protection from light. Works in progress were stored flat in shallow drawers lined with soft cloth, preventing the warping and damage that might result from improper handling. The spiritual atmosphere of the scriptorium was maintained through subtle reminders of its sacred purpose. A simple wooden cross hung on the eastern wall, positioned to catch the morning light in a way that created a gentle reminder of the divine purpose behind all earthly labor. The walls themselves bore no decoration that might distract from work, but their very plainness served to focus attention on the beauty being created rather than the space containing it. Silence was not strictly enforced in the scriptorium, as the illuminators occasionally needed to consult with one another or seek guidance from more experienced colleagues. However, the atmosphere naturally encouraged quiet concentration and conversations when they occurred. were conducted in low tones that did not disturb the meditative quality of the work environment. As the afternoon light shifted and deepened, casting new patterns of shadow and illumination across the working surfaces, the illuminators adapted their activities to make the best use of changing conditions. This flexibility, born of long experience and deep understanding of their craft, allowed them to maintain productivity throughout the day while ensuring that the quality of their work never suffered from inadequate lighting or unsuitable conditions. The scriptorium of Saint-Denis was thus far more than a simple workroom. It was a carefully orchestrated environment where every element, from the quality of light to the arrangement of tools, from the acoustic properties of the space to the spiritual atmosphere that pervaded it, served to support the creation of illuminated manuscripts that would inspire and educate for centuries to come. The life of an illuminator at Saint-Denis flowed according to rhythms as ancient and measured as the prayers that marked the monastery's daily offices. These rhythms were not arbitrary impositions, but organic patterns that had evolved over centuries to support both spiritual development and artistic achievement. The day began before dawn, not with harsh alarm bells, but with the gentle tolling that called the community to matins, the first prayer of the canonical hours. Brother Thomas rose from his narrow bed in the dormitory, where he slept alongside his fellow monks in cells barely large enough to contain a straw mattress and a small wooden chest for personal possessions. The dormitory was kept deliberately austere, with whitewashed walls and simple furnishings that encouraged the mind to focus on spiritual rather than material concerns. In the pure dawn darkness, illuminated only by the soft glow of oil lamps kept burning throughout the night, the monks moved quietly to their morning ablutions. The walk from dormitory to chapel provided a moment of transition between sleep and wakefulness, between the private realm of rest and the communal world of worship. The corridors of Saint-Denis, built from local stone and worn smooth by countless footsteps, created a sense of timeless continuity. Each step taken by Brother Thomas echoed those of illuminators who had walked these same paths for generations before him, creating an invisible chain of devotion that stretched back through the centuries. Matins itself was a service of particular beauty, conducted in the pure dawn darkness with only the flickering light of candles to illuminate the prayer books. The chanting of psalms and antiphons created an atmosphere of profound reverence, preparing the monks' minds for the day's work. For the illuminators, these morning prayers held special significance, as they offered thanks for the gift of artistic ability and sought divine guidance for the work ahead. The Latin phrases, repeated daily for years, became as familiar as breathing, their rhythm becoming part of the mental landscape that would shape the day's creative efforts. After matins came a brief return to the dormitory for private prayer and preparation for the day. This quiet time allowed each monk to center himself spiritually and mentally, preparing for the transition from worship to work. Brother Thomas used these moments to review the specific tasks that awaited him in the scriptorium, visualizing the pages he would work on and the techniques he would employ. This mental preparation was considered as important as the physical preparation of materials, as it aligned intention with action. The community gathered again for prime, the second canonical hour, as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern windows of the chapel. This service, briefer than matins but equally important, marked the official beginning of the working day. The prayers of prime included specific requests for guidance in daily labor, acknowledging that all human work, when performed with proper intention, became a form of worship. Breakfast at Saint-Denis was a simple meal, designed to nourish the body without distracting the mind from spiritual concerns. The monks ate in silence while one of their number read from scripture or the works of the church fathers. For the illuminators, this meal served not only physical needs, but also provided intellectual and spiritual nourishment that would influence their artistic work. The stories and teachings they heard during meals often found their way into the manuscripts they created, translated into visual form through the symbolic language of medieval art. The transition from refectory to scriptorium marked the beginning of the most productive period of the day. The morning hours, when minds were fresh and hands were steady, were reserved for the most demanding aspects of illumination. Brother Thomas would enter the scriptorium as the first strong light of day began to fill the tall windows, carrying with him the spiritual preparation of the morning prayers and the quiet anticipation of meaningful work. The rhythm of work in the scriptorium was punctuated by the canonical hours, creating a natural structure that prevented the exhaustion that might result from uninterrupted labor. At terce, the third hour, the illuminators would pause in their work for a brief service of prayer and thanksgiving. This interruption, rather than disrupting their concentration, actually enhanced it by providing regular opportunities for spiritual renewal and physical rest. During these prayer breaks, the illuminators had opportunities to examine each other's work, sharing techniques and offering suggestions for improvement. These informal consultations were conducted with the same reverence accorded to formal instruction, as each monk understood that his individual skills were gifts to be shared with the community, rather than treasures to be hoarded. The exchange of knowledge during these brief interludes contributed to the continuous refinement of techniques and the maintenance of high standards throughout the scriptorium. The midday meal, taken after the service of sext, provided a more substantial break in the day's routine. Like breakfast, it was consumed in silence while listening to edifying reading, but the food was more substantial, designed to sustain the monks through the afternoon hours of work. The illuminators paid particular attention to their diet, understanding that certain foods could affect the steadiness of their hands or the acuity of their vision. They avoided rich or heavy meals that might cause drowsiness, preferring simple fare that nourished without overwhelming. Afternoon work in the scriptorium had a different character from morning labor. As the light began to change and gradually fade, the illuminators shifted to tasks that were less dependent on perfect vision and steady hands. This might be the time for grinding pigments, preparing parchment, or working on larger areas of color that did not require the finest detail. The rhythm of afternoon work was often more collaborative, with experienced illuminators taking time to instruct novices or multiple monks working together on complex projects. The service of none, held in mid-afternoon, provided another opportunity for spiritual renewal and physical rest. By this time of day, the illuminators had been working for many hours, and a brief respite allowed them to refresh themselves for the final period of the working day. The prayers of none included expressions of gratitude for the progress made and requests for strength to complete the day's work with excellence. As evening approached and natural light began to fade, the illuminators prepared for the transition from work to evening prayer. The setting sun streaming through the western windows created a golden atmosphere in the scriptorium, a fitting end to another day devoted to the creation of beauty in service of divine truth. Tools were cleaned and put away with the same care they had been prepared with in the morning. Materials were properly stored, and work surfaces were cleared for the next day's labor. Vespers, the evening prayer service, was perhaps the most beautiful of all the canonical hours. Sung as darkness gathered outside the chapel windows, the service created an atmosphere of profound peace and completion. For the illuminators, Vespers provided an opportunity to offer their day's work to God, acknowledging both their achievements and their shortcomings while expressing gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the creation of lasting beauty. The final meal of the day was simple and brief, followed by a period of private study or meditation before compline, the last service of the day. This final prayer service prepared the community for sleep, asking for protection through the night and for rest that would refresh both body and spirit. For Brother Thomas and his fellow illuminators, compline marked the end of another day in the endless cycle of prayer and work that defined their lives. As they made their way back to the dormitory through corridors now lit only by oil lamps, The illuminators carried with them the satisfaction of another day devoted to meaningful labor. The pages they had worked on that day would become part of manuscripts that might survive for centuries, carrying their devotion and skill forward into an unknown future. In the quiet moments before sleep, they could reflect on the privilege of spending their lives in service to beauty and truth, creating works that glorified God while preserving human knowledge and wisdom. This daily rhythm, repeated year after year, created lives of profound meaning and purpose. The integration of prayer and work, of spiritual discipline and artistic achievement, produced not only magnificent manuscripts, but also human beings whose entire existence was harmonized around a single noble purpose. In this harmony lay both the secret of their artistic success and the source of their deep contentment. In the hushed chambers adjacent to the main scriptorium, where stone walls held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the illuminators of Saint-Denis performed what seemed like nothing less than alchemy. Here, in rooms specifically designed for the preparation and application of pigments, raw materials from the farthest corners of the known world were transformed into colors of such intensity and beauty that they appeared to capture fragments of divine light itself. Brother Thomas entered the pigment preparation chamber as the morning sun reached its optimal angle, casting steady beams through carefully positioned windows. The room hummed with quiet activity as several monks worked at different stages of color preparation, each focused on the meticulous processes that would transform earthly substances into heavenly hues. The air held the subtle fragrances of exotic materials, the mineral scent of groundstones, the organic sweetness of plant-based dyes, the metallic tang of precious metals being prepared for application. The preparation of ultramarine, that most precious of blues, required a process that could take weeks to complete and demanded the patience of a saint. The raw lapis lazuli, imported at enormous expense from the distant mountains of Afghanistan, arrived at the monastery in chunks that gave little hint of the glorious color locked within their crystalline structure. Brother Thomas examined the latest shipment with the practiced eye of a connoisseur, selecting pieces based on the intensity of their blue veins and the relative absence of white calcite inclusions that would dilute the final color. The first stage of ultramarine preparation involved the careful crushing of the selected stones using mortars carved from agate or other hard minerals. The crushing was performed by hand, with a slow, circular grinding motion that gradually reduced the lapis lazuli to powder while preserving the integrity of the color-bearing particles. This process could not be hurried, as excessive force or speed might damage the delicate crystal structure that gave ultramarine its unique properties. The sound of grinding became a meditative rhythm, the gentle scraping and crushing marking the slow transformation of stone into art material. Once properly crushed, the lapis lazuli powder faced its greatest challenge, the separation of pure blue particles from the colorless binding matrix that held them together. This was accomplished through a complex process that combined the knowledge of ancient alchemists with techniques refined through generations of artistic practice. The crushed stone was mixed with a carefully prepared blend of resins, waxes, and oils, creating a malleable paste that could be worked by hand to extract the blue pigment. The extraction process itself was almost ritualistic in its precision and patience. Brother Thomas would work the paste with his fingers, kneading and manipulating it under warm water while the precious blue particles gradually separated and dispersed into the liquid. This first extraction yielded ultramarine of the highest quality, suitable for the most important elements of illumination: the robes of the Virgin Mary, the vault of heaven in depictions of paradise, the ceremonial garments of saints and angels. Subsequent extractions, performed by continuing to work the paste under fresh water, yielded progressively lighter grades of blue. These secondary and tertiary ultramarines, while less intense than the first extraction, were still valuable pigments suitable for skies, decorative borders, and other elements where pure color was desired. but the expense of first-grade ultramarine was not justified. Nothing was wasted in this process, as even the final extractions produced colors of beauty and utility. The preparation of other pigments followed equally demanding protocols, each color presenting its own unique challenges and rewards. Vermilion, that brilliant red that would grace the robes of martyrs and the decorative elements of important texts, was created through the careful heating of cinnabar ore. The process required precise temperature control, achieved through techniques that had been passed down through generations of alchemists and metalworkers. Too little heat would fail to transform the mineral into usable pigment, while too much would destroy the color entirely. The creation of vermilion took place in a special chamber equipped with carefully designed furnaces that could maintain steady temperatures over long periods. Brother Thomas would monitor the process with the attention of a physician watching over a critically ill patient, adjusting the heat and timing based on subtle changes in color and texture that indicated the progress of the transformation. The resulting vermilion was a red of such intensity that it seemed to glow within a fire, perfect for creating visual elements that needed to command attention and convey spiritual significance. Gold preparation was perhaps the most sacred of all pigment-related activities, as this most precious of metals held deep symbolic meaning within Christian art. Gold represented divine light, eternal value, and the glory of heaven concepts that required the most careful and reverent treatment. The gold used at Saint-Denis arrived in various forms, sometimes as beaten leaf of incredible thinness, sometimes as powder that would be mixed with binding agents to create paint that could be applied with brushes. The handling of gold leaf required skills that bordered on the supernatural. The leaves, beaten to such thinness that they were nearly transparent, could be destroyed by the slightest breath or careless movement. Brother Thomas approached gold leaf application with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics, using specialized tools that had been consecrated for this purpose alone. The gilder's knife, used to lift and position the delicate leaves, was made from the finest steel and polished to mirror brightness to prevent any adhesion that might tear the precious material. The application of gold leaf required perfect timing and environmental control. The underlying surface had to be prepared with a special adhesive made from egg white and honey, applied in a thin, even layer and allowed to reach exactly the right degree of tackiness. Too wet, and the gold would wrinkle and tear. Too dry, and it would fail to adhere properly. The humidity in the gilding chamber was carefully controlled, with bowls of water positioned to maintain optimal conditions while avoiding the excessive moisture that could cause the gold to behave unpredictably. When conditions were perfect, Brother Thomas would lift a piece of gold leaf with his knife and position it over the prepared surface with movements so gentle they were barely perceptible. The transfer from knife to manuscript required a delicate breath of air, just enough to release the gold from the blade without disturbing its position. Once applied, the gold was burnished with smooth stones or specially prepared bones, a process that compressed the metal and created the brilliant shine that would catch and reflect light for centuries to come. Plant-based pigments offered different challenges and opportunities, requiring deep knowledge of botanical properties and seasonal cycles. The Illuminators of Saint-Denis maintained their own gardens where they grew many of the plants needed for color preparation. These gardens were not merely practical spaces, but contemplative environments, where the monks could observe the cycles of growth and decay that provided both physical materials and spiritual metaphors for their artistic work. The preparation of plant-based colors often followed the agricultural calendar, with different materials harvested at specific times of year, when their color-bearing properties were at their peak. The petals of certain flowers, collected at dawn when their color was most intense, would be processed immediately to preserve their vibrancy. Leaves and stems were often dried and stored for use throughout the year, while roots and bark might be aged to develop their full potential. The extraction of color from plant materials involved techniques that combined the knowledge of herbalists with the precision of chemists. Different plants required different approaches. Some yielded their colors readily when boiled in water, while others required complex processes involving fermentation, distillation, or treatment with various mineral salts. The illuminators maintained detailed records of their techniques, written in cipher to protect trade secrets while ensuring that knowledge could be passed to future generations. Mineral pigments presented yet another category of challenges, each one requiring specific techniques for preparation and application. Orpiment, a brilliant yellow derived from arsenic sulfide, produced colors of extraordinary intensity, but required careful handling due to its toxic properties. The monks who prepared orpiment worked in special chambers with enhanced ventilation, understanding that the beauty of the color came with inherent dangers that demanded respect and caution. Malachite and azurite, the copper-based minerals that provided greens and blues respectively, required careful grinding to achieve the proper particle size. Too fine, and the colors would appear dull and lifeless. Too coarse, and they would not adhere properly to the manuscript surface. The preparation of these minerals was as much art as science, requiring the illuminator to judge the proper consistency through experience and intuition rather than precise measurement. The mixing of pigments with binding agents was a critical skill that determined the final quality of the paint. Different pigments required different binders, and even the same pigment might require different treatments depending on how it would be used. Gum arabic, the most common binding agent, was prepared in various concentrations to achieve different effects. A light wash of color required a thin binder that would allow the pigment to flow smoothly across the parchment, while opaque applications needed heavier binders that would hold the pigment in place and prevent it from being disturbed by subsequent layers. The testing of pigments was an ongoing process that required both technical knowledge and aesthetic judgment. Each batch of prepared color was tested on small scraps of parchment to ensure proper consistency, color accuracy, and permanence. These test samples were often kept for years, allowing the illuminators to observe how their pigments aged and to refine their techniques accordingly. The most successful formulations were recorded in detailed notes that became part of the monastery's accumulated wisdom. Color mixing was perhaps the most creative aspect of pigment preparation, requiring not only technical skill, but also artistic vision. The illuminators of Saint-Denis developed sophisticated understanding of color relationships, learning how different pigments would interact when placed adjacent to each other or layered one upon another. They discovered that certain combinations would create optical effects that enhanced the overall impact of their work, while others might muddy or dull the desired result. The seasonal nature of some pigment preparation created natural rhythms within the scriptorium's yearly cycle. Spring brought fresh plant materials and the opportunity to replenish stocks of organic colors. Summer provided optimal conditions for certain extraction processes that required warm, dry weather. Autumn was the time for gathering and preserving materials that would be needed during the winter months. Winter became a time for working with stored materials and focusing on the mineral pigments that could be prepared regardless of weather conditions. As Brother Thomas worked through the morning hours, surrounded by the gentle sounds of grinding, mixing, and preparation, he understood that his labor was part of a tradition that stretched back through centuries and forward into an unknown future. Each batch of pigment he prepared carried within it the accumulated knowledge of generations, refined and perfected through countless hours of patient experimentation and devotion to excellence. The colors that emerged from this careful preparation would soon find their way onto manuscript pages, where they would serve not merely decorative purposes, but spiritual ones. Each hue carried symbolic meaning. Each shade contributed to the complex visual language through which the illuminated manuscripts communicated divine truth. In the careful preparation of these materials, Brother Thomas participated in a form of prayer that united earthly craft with heavenly purpose. In the quietest corner of the scriptorium, where morning light fell most gently through tall windows, Brother Thomas bent over his writing desk with the concentrated attention of a master craftsman creating something that would endure for centuries. The art of sacred lettering, or calligraphy as it would later be known, was the foundation upon which all illuminated manuscripts rested. Without perfectly formed letters arranged in harmonious lines, the most beautiful decorative elements would lose their meaning and purpose. The formation of each letter was a meditation in itself, requiring not only technical precision but spiritual preparation. Brother Thomas began each writing session with a brief prayer, asking for guidance in forming letters that would be worthy vessels for sacred text. His hand, steady from years of practice, held the carefully prepared quill with the relaxed grip that allowed for both control and fluidity. The quill itself had been selected and cut specifically for the style of writing he would perform that day. Its nib shaped to produce the precise line weight and character formation that the manuscript required. The script employed at Saint-Denis during this period was primarily Carolingian minuscule, a writing style that had been refined during the reign of Charlemagne and had become the standard for formal manuscripts throughout much of medieval Europe. This script represented a perfect balance between legibility and beauty, with letter forms that were clear enough for easy reading while possessing the elegant proportions that made each page a work of art. The development of Carolingian minuscule had been one of the great achievements of medieval scholarship, providing a standardized writing system that allowed for the efficient copying and distribution of texts while maintaining the highest aesthetic standards. The preparation for a day of writing began long before quill touched parchment. Brother Thomas would first review the text he was to copy, reading through the passage to understand its meaning and identify any potential challenges in layout or spacing. This preliminary reading was not merely practical but spiritual, as understanding the text's meaning would influence how it was presented visually. A passage describing divine love might be written with slightly more expansive letter spacing to convey a sense of joy and openness, while a text dealing with penance might be rendered more compactly to reflect the gravity of its subject. The ruling of pages was a critical preliminary step that required mathematical precision and aesthetic judgment. Using a straight edge and a sharp-pointed tool, Brother Thomas would mark guidelines that would ensure uniform line spacing and proper margins throughout the manuscript. These guidelines were drawn lightly, just deeply enough to provide guidance without creating marks that would interfere with the finished appearance of the page. The spacing between lines had to accommodate not only the text itself, but also the ascenders and descenders of letters, while leaving room for any decorative elements that might be added later. The proportions of the written area to the surrounding margins followed principles that had been refined over centuries of manuscript production. The margins were not merely empty space, but active elements in the page's composition, providing visual rest that allowed the eye to focus on the text while creating a sense of dignity and formality appropriate to sacred literature. The relationship between text and margin was carefully calculated to create pages that were both beautiful and functional, with proportions that would remain pleasing even after the manuscript was bound, and some margin space was lost to the binding process. The actual writing process required a level of concentration that was almost mystical in its intensity. Brother Thomas would position himself at his writing desk as the morning light reached its optimal angle, ensuring that the illumination fell evenly across his work surface without creating shadows that might interfere with accurate letter formation. His posture was carefully maintained to prevent fatigue while allowing maximum control over the writing instrument, with his body positioned to support steady, flowing movements. The rhythm of writing was crucial to maintaining consistency throughout long passages of text. Brother Thomas had developed, through years of practice, an internal tempo that allowed him to form letters at a steady pace while maintaining the careful attention to detail that each character required. This rhythm was not mechanical but organic, following natural patterns of breathing and heartbeat that helped sustain concentration over long periods. The sound of quill on parchment created a gentle scratching rhythm that became part of the meditative atmosphere of the scriptorium. Each letter was formed through a series of carefully choreographed pen strokes, with the sequence and direction of strokes having been standardized to ensure consistency and efficiency. The letter A, for example, began with a curved stroke forming the bowl of the character, followed by a straight stroke that created the right side and connected to the first stroke at precisely the right angle. These stroke sequences had been refined over generations to produce letters that were not only beautiful, but also efficient to write, allowing scribes to maintain their pace while preserving the integrity of each character's form. The management of ink flow was a constant concern that required both technical knowledge and intuitive understanding of materials. The quill had to be loaded with just the right amount of ink to produce clean, even lines without blotting or skipping. Too much ink would cause letters to spread and blur, while too little would result in thin, weak strokes that lacked the authority appropriate to sacred text. Brother Thomas had learned to judge ink load by the feel of the quill against the parchment, making subtle adjustments throughout the writing process to maintain optimal conditions. Spacing between letters and words required careful judgment that combined mathematical precision with aesthetic sensitivity. The spaces had to be large enough to ensure legibility while remaining small enough to maintain the visual unity of each line. Word spacing was particularly critical, as it affected both readability and the overall appearance of the text block. Inconsistent spacing could create distracting patterns of light and dark that would interfere with smooth reading, while overly uniform spacing might produce a mechanical appearance that lacked the subtle variations that made hand-lettered text visually engaging. The handling of abbreviations was both a practical necessity and an art form in itself. Medieval manuscripts employed extensive systems of abbreviation that allowed scribes to save both time and precious parchment while maintaining textual accuracy. These abbreviations followed established conventions that had been standardized throughout Christendom, ensuring that manuscripts could be read accurately by scholars regardless of where they had been produced. The formation of abbreviation marks required the same precision as regular letters, and their integration into the text had to maintain the overall rhythm and appearance of the writing. Error correction in manuscript production was a delicate process that required both technical skill and aesthetic judgment. When mistakes occurred, they could not simply be erased or covered with correction fluid as might be done in modern times. Instead, errors had to be corrected through techniques that preserved the integrity of the parchment while maintaining the visual harmony of the page. Minor errors might be corrected by careful scraping with a sharp knife, removing the incorrect letters without damaging the writing surface. More significant errors might require the insertion of correction patches, pieces of parchment carefully matched to the original and seamlessly integrated into the page. The coordination between scribe and illuminator was essential to the success of any manuscript project. Brother Thomas worked closely with the monks who would add decorative elements to his carefully lettered pages, leaving appropriate spaces for initial letters, marginal decorations, and illustrations. This collaboration required detailed planning and clear communication, as any miscalculation in spacing could compromise the entire project. The scribe had to understand the illuminator's requirements, while the illuminator had to respect the integrity of the text layout. Different types of text required different approaches to letter formation and spacing. Biblical passages might be written in a more formal, ceremonial style that emphasized the sacred nature of the content, while commentaries or glosses could be rendered in smaller, more compact scripts that maximized the amount of text that could fit on each page. The hierarchy of text types was reflected in the size and style of lettering, with the most important texts receiving the most formal treatment. The physical demands of sustained writing required careful attention to health and endurance. Brother Thomas had learned techniques for maintaining steady hand movement while preventing the muscle fatigue that could compromise letter quality. Regular breaks for prayer and meditation were not only spiritually beneficial, but also physically necessary, allowing muscles to relax and circulation to be restored. The Illuminators understood that their bodies were instruments of their craft, requiring the same careful maintenance as their pens and brushes. Quality control was maintained through both self-monitoring and peer review. Brother Thomas regularly examined his own work with a critical eye, checking for consistency in letter formation, spacing, and alignment. Senior scribes would also review ongoing work, offering guidance and correction when necessary. This system of continuous quality monitoring ensured that the high standards of the scriptorium were maintained while providing opportunities for less experienced scribes to learn from their more accomplished colleagues. The completion of a page of text was marked by a moment of quiet satisfaction, as Brother Thomas would review his work one final time before moving on to the next page. Each completed page represented hours of concentrated labor, but also participation in the grand project of preserving and transmitting human knowledge and divine wisdom. The letters he had formed with such care would carry their message across centuries, connecting his medieval world with readers yet unborn. As the morning session drew to a close and the bells rang for the next canonical hour, Brother Thomas would carefully clean his quill and close his ink pot, preparing his workspace for the next period of writing. The rhythm of daily life in the scriptorium provided natural breaks that prevented fatigue while maintaining momentum on long-term projects. In this careful balance between intensive work and regular rest, the Illuminators found a sustainable approach to their demanding craft that allowed them to maintain the highest standards while preserving their health and spiritual well-being. As the morning light reached its perfect clarity, streaming through the tall windows of the scriptorium and casting everything in soft, even illumination, Brother Thomas prepared for what many considered the most sublime aspect of manuscript illumination, the application of gold. This was not merely a decorative process, but a sacred act that transformed earthly materials into symbols of divine light, creating elements that would catch and hold the glow of candles for centuries, making each manuscript page shimmer with heavenly radiance. The preparation for gold work began days in advance, as the conditions had to be precisely controlled for successful application. The scriptorium's atmosphere was carefully monitored, with special attention paid to humidity and temperature. Too much moisture in the air could cause the gold leaf to wrinkle and tear, while excessive dryness might prevent proper adhesion. Brother Thomas had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated perfect conditions, the way his breath condensed slightly in the cooler morning air, the feel of the parchment under his fingers, the behavior of other materials in the workspace. The tools required for gold application were specialized instruments that were used for no other purpose. The gilder's knife, forged from the finest steel and polished to a mirror finish, was kept wrapped in silk when not in use to protect its perfect surface. This knife would be used to lift the incredibly delicate gold leaf from its protective sheets and position it precisely where it was needed. The blade had to be completely smooth and free from even the tiniest imperfection, as any roughness could tear the fragile metal. The burnishing tools were equally important, craft from materials chosen for their hardness and smoothness. Some were made from agate or other semi-precious stones, ground and polished to create surfaces that could compress and shine the gold without scratching or disturbing it. Others were fashioned from specially prepared animal bones, usually from wolves or dogs, which had been aged, cleaned, and polished until they achieved the perfect combination of hardness and smoothness. These tools were treasured possessions, often passed down from master to apprentice and considered as valuable as the gold they helped apply. The gold leaf itself arrived at Saint-Denis in books of extraordinary delicacy, with each leaf separated by sheets of specially prepared vellum. The leaves were so thin that they seemed more like golden breath than solid metal, requiring the gentlest handling to prevent their destruction. A single careless movement could reduce a precious leaf to unusable fragments, making the handling of gold leaf a skill that required years to master fully. The preparation of the receiving surface was critical to successful gold application. Brother Thomas would first examine the area to be gilded, ensuring that the parchment was perfectly clean and smooth. Any particle of dust or slight roughness could create problems during application, causing the gold to lie unevenly or fail to adhere properly. The surface was often burnished lightly with smooth tools to compress the parchment fibers and create an ideal foundation for the adhesive. The adhesive used for gold leaf was typically made from egg white mixed with a small amount of honey, creating a substance that would become tacky when dry but could be reactivated with moisture. The preparation of this adhesive was an art in itself, requiring precise proportions and careful mixing to achieve the proper consistency. Too much honey would make the mixture too sticky and difficult to work with, while too little would result in poor adhesion that might allow the gold to lift off the page over time. The application of the adhesive required extraordinary precision, as it had to be spread in an even, thin layer exactly where the gold would be placed. Brother Thomas used special brushes made from the finest sable hairs, their tips shaped to hold just the right amount of adhesive while allowing for precise control. The brushwork had to be smooth and confident, as any hesitation or unevenness would be visible in the final result. The adhesive was allowed to dry to the perfect degree of tackiness, a state that could be judged only through experience and intuition. The moment of gold application was perhaps the most challenging and rewarding aspect of the entire illumination process. Brother Thomas would open the book of gold leaf with movements so gentle they were barely perceptible, exposing the precious metal to the air for the shortest possible time. Using his knife, he would lift a single leaf, supporting it carefully to prevent tearing, and position it over the prepared surface. The transfer from knife to manuscript required perfect timing and the most delicate touch, often aided by a gentle breath that would release the gold from the blade without disturbing its position. Once the gold leaf was in place, the initial pressing was done with a soft brush or cloth, applying just enough pressure to ensure contact with the adhesive without damaging the delicate metal. This first contact was critical, as any air bubbles or wrinkles that formed at this stage would be impossible to remove later. The gold had to conform perfectly to the surface, following any slight texture in the parchment while maintaining its continuity and brilliance. The burnishing process was where the magic truly happened, transforming the dull, matte appearance of newly applied gold leaf into the brilliant, mirror-like surface that would catch and reflect light for centuries. Brother Thomas would work systematically across the gilded area, using his burnishing tools with gradually increasing pressure to compress the gold and develop its shine. The pressure had to be carefully controlled to light, and the gold would remain dull, too heavy, and it might be damaged or pushed off the adhesive. The burnishing created its own rhythm and music, a soft scraping sound that changed as the gold transformed from matte to brilliant. Brother Thomas could hear the moment when the burnishing was complete, as the sound would change subtly to indicate that the gold had achieved its maximum brightness. This auditory feedback was one of the many ways that experienced illuminators used all their senses to judge the quality of their work. Different applications of gold required different techniques. Large areas might be covered with overlapping pieces of leaf, with the joints carefully burnished to invisibility. Delicate linear work might require gold leaf to be cut into thin strips before application, a process that demanded extraordinary skill to prevent the fragile metal from disintegrating. Some decorative elements required gold to be applied over raised areas created with gesso or other materials, adding a three-dimensional quality that would catch light from multiple angles. Gold paint, created by grinding gold leaf or powder with binding agents, offered different possibilities for manuscript decoration. This form of gold could be applied with brushes, allowing for fine linear work and detailed decorative elements that would have been impossible to achieve with leaf alone. The preparation of gold paint required careful attention to the grinding process, which had to reduce the metal to fine particles without destroying its reflective properties. The binding agent had to be strong enough to hold the gold particles in suspension while remaining thin enough to flow smoothly from the brush. The symbolic significance of gold in medieval manuscripts was profound, representing divine light, eternal value, and the glory of heaven. This symbolism influenced how gold was used within each composition, with the most important elements receiving the richest gold treatment. The halos of saints were always gilded, as were the architectural elements representing heavenly buildings. Decorative borders might incorporate gold to create patterns that suggested the infinite complexity of divine creation. The interaction between gold and other pigments was carefully considered during the planning stages of each manuscript. Gold enhanced certain colors while potentially overwhelming others, and the illuminators had to balance these effects to create harmonious compositions. The placement of gold elements within each page was planned to create visual pathways that would guide the reader's eye while emphasizing the most important textual and symbolic elements. Quality control in gold work was particularly demanding, as mistakes were difficult or impossible to correct. If gold leaf was improperly applied, it might have to be carefully removed and the process repeated, potentially damaging the underlying work. The illuminators developed techniques for testing their materials and methods on scraps of parchment before working on actual manuscript pages, ensuring that conditions were optimal before attempting critical applications. The aging characteristics of gold were well understood by medieval illuminators, who knew that properly applied gold would retain its beauty indefinitely. Unlike many other pigments, which might fade or change color over time, gold would remain as brilliant after centuries as it appeared on the day of application. This permanence made gold particularly suitable for the most important manuscripts, which were expected to serve their communities for generations. The economics of gold use required careful planning and budgeting. The precious metal was expensive, and its use had to be justified by the importance of the manuscript being created. The illuminators developed techniques for maximizing the visual impact of gold while minimizing waste, using the metal most effectively, where it would contribute most to the overall composition. Scraps of gold leaf were carefully saved and could often be used for smaller decorative elements. The seasonal aspects of gold work were influenced by environmental conditions within the scriptorium. Winter months, when humidity was more easily controlled and temperatures were stable, were often preferred for the most demanding gold applications. Summer work required extra attention to atmospheric conditions, with the illuminators developing techniques for maintaining optimal humidity and preventing the gold from being affected by temperature variations. Training in gold work was a gradual process that began with observation and simple tasks before progressing to more complex applications. Novice illuminators might spend months learning to handle the tools properly and develop the steady hand control necessary for a successful gold application. The training emphasized patience and precision, as these qualities were essential for success in this most demanding aspect of manuscript illumination. As Brother Thomas completed another section of gold work, carefully cleaning his tools and storing the remaining gold leaf for future use, he reflected on the profound satisfaction that came from this most challenging aspect of his craft. The gold he had applied would catch the light of candles in monastery libraries for centuries to come, creating moments of beauty and wonder that would inspire countless readers to contemplate the divine mysteries contained within the manuscript's pages. The golden elements he had created were more than mere decoration, they were windows into heaven, fragments of eternal light captured in earthly form and preserved for future generations. In this transformation of base materials into symbols of transcendence, Brother Thomas participated in the fundamental mystery of artistic creation, where human skill and divine inspiration combined to produce beauty that would outlast empires and speak across the centuries of humanity's eternal aspiration toward the sublime. Beyond the stone walls of the scriptorium, where the ordered world of manuscript creation met the natural rhythms of earth and season, lay the Illuminators' garden, a carefully cultivated sanctuary where plants grown specifically for their color-yielding properties created living libraries of potential beauty. Brother Thomas often found himself drawn to this peaceful space, where the cycle of growth and harvest provided both the raw materials for his art and moments of contemplation that refreshed his spirit between long hours of concentrated indoor work. The Garden of Saint-Denis had been planned and developed over generations, with each successive gardener adding knowledge and plants that expanded the palette available to the Illuminators. This was not a decorative garden in the modern sense, but a working landscape where every plant served a specific purpose in the creation of illuminated manuscripts. The layout reflected both practical considerations and spiritual symbolism, with beds arranged to maximize growing conditions while creating patterns that spoke to the ordered beauty of divine creation. The morning hours found Brother Thomas walking the gravel paths that divided the garden into manageable sections, each dedicated to plants that would yield specific colors or serve particular functions in the illumination process. The early light revealed dewdrops clinging to leaves and petals, and he knew that this was often the optimal time for harvesting many color-bearing materials, when the plant's essential properties were most concentrated and the colors most intense. The blue section of the garden held special fascination, as true blue pigments were among the most difficult to obtain from plant sources, while the precious ultramarine came from imported minerals. The Illuminators had discovered several native plants that could yield useful blues for less critical applications. Woad, with its unremarkable yellow flowers, was the most important of these, capable of producing shades ranging from pale sky blue to deep indigo, depending on processing techniques and growing conditions. The cultivation of woad required specific timing and careful attention to soil conditions. Brother Thomas had learned that the plants harvested in their first year yielded the best color, with leaves picked just as the plant was beginning to flower, providing the most intense blue. The timing was critical to early, and the color would be weak too late, and the quality would decline as the plant directed its energy towards seed production. The processing of woad was a complex procedure that began in the garden and continued in specially designated preparation areas within the monastery complex. The fresh leaves had to be processed quickly after harvesting to prevent deterioration of the color-bearing compounds. Brother Thomas would gather the leaves in the early morning hours, when their moisture content was optimal, and carry them immediately to the processing area where they would begin their transformation into usable pigment. The red section of the garden was perhaps the most visually striking, filled with plants whose flowers, roots, or berries would yield the warm colors that brought life and vitality to manuscript pages. Madder root was the most important source of red pigment from the garden, its extensive root system developing the deep crimson color over several growing seasons. The cultivation of madder required patience, as the plant needed at least 3 years to develop roots with sufficient color concentration to justify harvesting. The harvesting of madder roots was an autumn activity, timed to coincide with the plant's dormant season when the color-bearing compounds were most concentrated in the root system. Brother Thomas would carefully excavate the roots, cleaning them thoroughly before beginning the long process of drying and preparation that would eventually yield the brilliant red pigment that graced so many manuscript pages. The work was labor-intensive but deeply satisfying, connecting the illuminator directly with the earth that provided his materials. Other red-yielding plants required different approaches and timing. Kermes insects harvested from certain oak trees within the monastery grounds provided a red of extraordinary intensity and permanence. The collection of these tiny creatures required precise timing, as they had to be gathered at the moment when their color-bearing properties were at their peak. The work was meticulous and time-consuming, but the resulting pigment was so valuable that it justified the enormous effort required for its collection. The yellow section of the garden blazed with the flowers and leaves that would provide the golden hues essential to manuscript illumination. Saffron, the most precious of all yellow pigments from plant sources, required the cultivation of special crocus varieties and the painstaking collection of stigmas from thousands of flowers. Each crocus bloom yielded only 3 stigmas, and it required hundreds of flowers to produce even a small amount of usable pigment. The cultivation of saffron crocus required specialized knowledge and careful attention to growing conditions. The bulbs were planted in specially prepared beds with perfect drainage, as excess moisture could cause rot and destroy an entire crop. The timing of harvest was critical. The stigmas had to be collected on the morning the flowers opened, before the sun could fade their intense color. Brother Thomas approached saffron harvest with the reverence due to such precious material, working in the cool dawn hours to collect the delicate stigmas before the heat of the day could diminish their value. Weld, another important yellow-yielding plant, was easier to cultivate but required different processing techniques. The entire plant could be harvested when in full bloom, then dried and processed to extract the golden yellow dye that would color numerous manuscript elements. The cultivation of weld was more straightforward than saffron, but still required attention to soil conditions and timing to achieve optimal color yield. The green section of the garden provided materials for one of the most challenging colors to achieve in medieval illumination. True green pigments were difficult to create and often unstable, leading illuminators to develop complex techniques using combinations of yellow and blue materials. Some plants, however, could yield serviceable greens directly, and Brother Thomas cultivated several varieties that had proven useful for specific applications. Iris flowers provided a green that was particularly suitable for landscape elements and decorative borders. The processing required careful timing and specific techniques to preserve the green compounds, which were often more fragile than other color-bearing substances. The work of extracting green from iris flowers was delicate and could not be hurried, requiring the same patience and attention to detail that characterized all aspects of manuscript illumination. The seasonal nature of the garden work created natural rhythms within the illuminator's yearly cycle, with different colors becoming available at different times of the year. Spring brought fresh shoots and early flowers. Summer provided the peak harvest for many flowering plants. Autumn was the time for root gathering and seed collection, while winter became a time for processing stored materials and planning for the next growing season. The integration of garden work with manuscript creation required careful planning and coordination. Brother Thomas had to anticipate the pigment needs for upcoming projects and ensure that appropriate materials would be available when needed. This required understanding not only the growing cycles of his plants, but also the planned schedule of manuscript production, balancing immediate needs with long-term planning. The spiritual dimension of garden work was never absent from the illuminator's consciousness. The cultivation of plants for artistic purposes connected them directly with the creative processes of nature, providing tangible reminders of the divine artistry that surrounded them. In the careful tending of plants that would eventually contribute to the glorification of God through beautiful manuscripts, Brother Thomas found a form of prayer that engaged his body as well as his spirit. The garden also served educational purposes, providing a living laboratory where novice illuminators could learn about the sources of their materials and the natural processes that made the art possible. Young monks would work alongside experienced gardeners, learning to recognize the signs that indicated optimal harvesting time and beginning to understand the complex relationships between growing conditions, processing techniques, and final color quality. Weather presented constant challenges and opportunities in the garden work. Drought could concentrate color-bearing compounds in some plants while destroying others, requiring the illuminators to adapt their harvesting and processing schedules to take advantage of whatever conditions nature provided. Excessive rain might delay harvesting, but could also promote vigorous growth that would yield abundant materials in the following season. The preservation and storage of plant materials required specialized knowledge and facilities. Different plants required different storage conditions to preserve their color-bearing properties, with some needing to be processed immediately, while others could be dried and stored for months or even years. Brother Thomas maintained detailed records of harvesting and storage techniques, contributing to the accumulated knowledge that would benefit future generations of illuminators. As evening approached and Brother Thomas completed another day's work in the garden, gathering the last materials before the light faded, he reflected on the profound connection between the earth beneath his hands and the beautiful manuscripts that graced the monastery's library. The plants he tended with such care would eventually contribute their colors to pages that might outlast the garden itself, carrying forward the beauty of growing things into future centuries where they would continue to inspire and delight readers yet unborn. The cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and processing connected the illuminators directly with the fundamental processes of creation, reminding them daily that their art depended not only on human skill, but also on the generous provision of the natural world. In this dependence lay both humility and gratitude, qualities that infused their work with a depth of meaning that transcended mere technical excellence and transformed their craft into a form of worship. In the scriptorium's afternoon light, as shadows began to lengthen and the quality of illumination shifted from the crisp clarity of morning to the warmer tones that preceded evening, Brother Thomas turned his attention to one of the most sophisticated aspects of manuscript illumination: the integration of text and image into unified compositions that served both aesthetic and educational purposes. This was where the illuminator's role as artist merged with his calling as teacher, creating visual narratives that would make complex theological concepts accessible to viewers across the centuries. The manuscript currently before Brother Thomas was a psalter, one of the most important types of illuminated books produced at Saint-Denis. The Psalms, with their rich imagery and emotional range, provided ideal opportunities for illumination that could enhance understanding while creating visual beauty. But the successful integration of text and image required careful planning, deep understanding of the text's meaning, and sophisticated artistic skills that had taken decades to develop fully. The process began with the careful study of the text to be illuminated, not merely reading the words, but contemplating their deeper meanings and identifying opportunities for visual interpretation. Brother Thomas would read each psalm multiple times, considering how its themes and imagery might be translated into visual form. Some psalms lent themselves naturally to specific types of illustration. Psalm 23, with its references to shepherds and green pastures, invited pastoral scenes that could make the text's comfort more tangible to viewers. The planning of illuminated pages required understanding of both macro and micro compositional elements. At the macro level, Brother Thomas had to consider how illustrations would relate to the overall page layout, ensuring that decorative elements enhanced rather than competed with the text for the reader's attention. At the micro level, he had to plan how specific details within illustrations would support textual meanings, creating layers of visual commentary that could be read alongside the written words. Initial letters, or initials as they were known, represented one of the most important forms of text-image integration. These enlarged letters that began important sections of text were transformed into elaborate compositions that could contain entire narrative scenes while maintaining their function as readable letters. The creation of historiated initials required Brother Thomas to work simultaneously as calligrapher, illustrator, and designer, ensuring that the letter remained recognizable while accommodating complex imagery within its form. The letter B that began Psalm 1, Beatus vocui non habet, blessed is the man who does not walk, provided an ideal framework for illustrating the psalm's contrast between righteous and wicked behavior. Brother Thomas planned to show within the letter's curves the righteous man contemplating scripture, while the descender of the latter could contain imagery of the wicked being blown away like chaff. The challenge lay in making these narrative elements clear and readable while maintaining the letter's essential form and proportions. The hierarchy of illustration within manuscripts followed established conventions that reflected the relative importance of different textual elements. Full-page illustrations were reserved for the most significant moments or concepts, while smaller images might accompany less central passages. This visual hierarchy helped readers navigate the manuscript while ensuring that artistic resources were allocated appropriately to match textual priorities. Marginal illustrations occupied a special category within manuscript design, offering opportunities for more playful or supplementary imagery that could comment on or extend the main text. These marginal elements might include decorative borders, small narrative scenes, or symbolic imagery that provided additional layers of meaning for contemplative readers. Brother Thomas particularly enjoyed working on marginal decorations, as they allowed for more creative freedom while still serving the manuscript's overall purpose. The symbolic language of medieval art was complex and sophisticated, with specific colors, objects, animals, and compositional arrangements carrying established meanings that educated viewers would understand immediately. A lamb represented Christ's sacrificial nature, while a lion might symbolize both Christ's royal authority and the devil's threatening presence, depending on context. Brother Thomas had spent years learning this visual vocabulary, understanding that successful illumination required fluency in symbolic communication as well as technical artistic skill. Color symbolism played a crucial role in text-image integration, with specific hues carrying theological significance that enhanced textual meaning. Blue, particularly the precious ultramarine, was reserved for depictions of divine subjects, most notably the Virgin Mary's robes. Red could represent both divine love and martyrdom, while white symbolized purity and resurrection. The careful deployment of symbolic colors throughout a manuscript created visual threads that connected different sections and reinforced important theological themes. The integration of architectural elements within illuminations reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. Buildings and architectural details provided spatial contexts for narrative scenes, while also carrying symbolic meanings related to the heavenly Jerusalem, or the Church as institution. Brother Thomas had developed particular skill in rendering Gothic architectural elements that reflected contemporary building styles, while incorporating symbolic details that enhanced textual meanings. Landscape elements within illuminations served similar dual purposes, providing naturalistic settings for narrative scenes while carrying symbolic significance. Gardens represented paradise or the church's nurturing care, while wilderness areas might symbolize spiritual testing or the world's dangers. The careful balance between naturalistic representation and symbolic meaning required Brother Thomas to consider both visual effectiveness and theological appropriateness in every landscape element. The treatment of human figures within illuminated manuscripts followed established conventions that balanced individual characterization with symbolic representation. Saints were typically depicted with specific attributes that made them easily recognizable: Saint Peter with keys, Saint Paul with a sword, Saint Lawrence with a gridiron. These iconographic conventions helped viewers identify figures quickly while creating visual consistency across different manuscripts and artistic traditions. The proportions and positioning of figures within compositions followed principles that emphasized their relative spiritual importance rather than naturalistic spatial relationships. Christ or the Virgin Mary might be depicted larger than other figures regardless of their position in space, while evil figures might be shown smaller or in lower positions to reflect their spiritual status. These hierarchical arrangements created visual theologies that reinforced textual messages about spiritual relationships and values. The interaction between Latin text and vernacular imagery created opportunities for making sophisticated theological concepts accessible to viewers who might not be fully literate in Latin. The visual narratives could provide interpretive guidance for textual passages, while the juxtaposition of word and image created richer meaning than either element could achieve independently. Brother Thomas understood his role as a translator between textual and visual languages, making abstract concepts concrete through carefully chosen imagery. The temporal aspects of narrative illustration required sophisticated compositional techniques that could represent events unfolding over time within static images. A single illustration might show multiple moments from a biblical story, with figures repeated to show different stages of action. These continuous narratives demanded careful planning to ensure clarity while maximizing the storytelling potential of limited space. The integration of decorative and narrative elements required careful balance to maintain both visual beauty and functional clarity. Ornamental borders and decorative patterns had to enhance rather than overwhelm the narrative content, while providing visual richness appropriate to the manuscript's sacred purpose. Brother Thomas had learned to create decorative elements that supported rather than competed with illustrative content, using pattern and color to create unified compositions. Quality control in text-image integration required constant evaluation of how successfully the various elements work together. Brother Thomas would regularly step back from his work to assess whether the overall composition achieved the desired balance between beauty and meaning. This evaluative process involved considering how viewers would approach the page, ensuring that the visual elements guided attention appropriately while supporting comprehension of the textual content. The collaborative aspects of manuscript production required careful coordination between different specialists. Brother Thomas worked closely with the scribes who created the text layouts, ensuring that sufficient space was allocated for planned illustrations while maintaining appropriate text density. This collaboration extended to discussions about textual variants and interpretations that might affect illustrative content. The educational function of illuminated manuscripts influenced every aspect of text-image integration. Brother Thomas understood that his illustrations would serve as teaching tools for generations of readers, making complex theological concepts more accessible through visual representation. This educational purpose required clarity and accuracy in iconographic details while maintaining the artistic quality that would engage and hold viewers' attention. Seasonal and liturgical considerations influenced the planning of illuminated manuscripts, with specific images planned to coincide with important feast days or liturgical seasons. A psalter might include special illustrations for psalms commonly used during Easter or Christmas celebrations, enhancing the manuscript's utility for liturgical purposes while providing opportunities for seasonally appropriate imagery. The preservation of artistic traditions required Brother Thomas to maintain consistency with established iconographic conventions while allowing for individual artistic expression. This balance between tradition and innovation ensured that manuscripts from Saint-Denis would be recognizable as products of their time and place while participating in the broader traditions of Christian art. As afternoon light continued to evolve in the scriptorium, Brother Thomas reflected on the profound responsibility of creating images that would shape how future generations understood and visualized sacred texts. His illustrations would become permanent interpretations of biblical passages, influencing how readers imagine divine subjects and spiritual concepts. In this interpretive role lay both the challenge and the privilege of manuscript illumination, the opportunity to participate in the ongoing dialogue between human understanding and divine revelation that defined medieval Christianity. The harmony between text and image that Brother Thomas strived to achieve in every manuscript represented more than mere aesthetic success. It embodied the medieval understanding that all aspects of creation could work together to reveal divine truth, that beauty and meaning were not separate categories but complementary expressions of the same underlying reality. In this integration of word and image, scripture and art, human craft and divine inspiration, the illuminated manuscripts of Saint Denis achieved their highest purpose as vessels for both beauty and wisdom. As the seasons turned and years passed within the quiet walls of Saint Denis, the accumulated work of generations of illuminators created a treasury of beauty and wisdom that would outlast empires and speak across centuries to readers yet unborn. Brother Thomas, now graying at the temples and bearing the gentle dignity that came with decades of devoted service, often found himself reflecting on the profound legacy being created by patient hands and faithful hearts in the monastery's scriptorium. The completed manuscripts that filled the abbey's library represented far more than individual artistic achievements. Each book was a link in an unbroken chain of cultural transmission, carrying forward the accumulated knowledge and spiritual wisdom of Christian civilization, while adding the unique contributions of its creators. The illuminated psalters, gospel books, and theological treatises produced at Saint Denis would serve not only the immediate community, but also scholars, clergy, and faithful readers throughout medieval Europe and beyond. The influence of Saint Denis' illumination extended far beyond the monastery's walls, through a network of artistic and intellectual exchange that connected the great religious centers of Europe. Manuscripts created at the abbey traveled to other monasteries, cathedral schools, and royal courts, carrying with them the distinctive artistic vocabulary and technical innovations developed by generations of illuminators. Young monks trained at Saint Denis would eventually establish scriptoriums at other locations, spreading the abbey's methods and aesthetic principles throughout the broader Christian world. The preservation of classical learning represented one of the most significant aspects of the illuminators' legacy. In an age when much of the intellectual heritage of antiquity was at risk of being lost forever, the monks of Saint Denis served as guardians and transmitters of ancient wisdom. Their illuminated manuscripts of classical authors, early Christian writings, and contemporary theological works created permanent repositories of knowledge that would survive the political upheavals and social transformations of the medieval period. Brother Thomas understood that his individual contributions were part of this larger preservation effort, with each page he illuminated adding to humanity's accumulated store of beauty and knowledge. The psalter currently before him would outlive not only himself, but likely the stone buildings that housed its creation. The gold he applied with such care would retain its brilliance for centuries. The pigments he ground from precious materials would continue to glow with their original intensity, and the careful integration of text and image would continue to instruct and inspire readers in ages yet to come. The technical innovations developed within the Saint Denis scriptorium had implications that extended far beyond manuscript production. The advances in pigment preparation, the refinements in gold application techniques, and the sophisticated approaches to color theory would influence not only other manuscript illuminators but also panel painters, fresco artists, and craftsmen working in various decorative arts. The abbey's reputation for technical excellence attracted visitors and correspondents who carried these innovations back to their own workshops and communities. The training of new generations of illuminators represented perhaps the most important aspect of the abbey's ongoing legacy. Brother Thomas had watched young novices enter the scriptorium with uncertain hands and basic skills, then witnessed their gradual development into accomplished artists capable of producing work that equaled or surpassed their masters. This continuous cycle of instruction and learning ensured that the knowledge accumulated over centuries would not be lost, but would continue to evolve and improve with each succeeding generation. The pedagogical methods developed at Saint-Denis balanced respect for tradition with encouragement of individual artistic expression. Young illuminators learned fundamental techniques through careful copying of established models, while gradually being encouraged to develop their own interpretive approaches to familiar subjects. This system produced artists who could maintain the Abbey's distinctive style while contributing their own innovations and insights to the ongoing development of the tradition. The spiritual formation that accompanied artistic training was considered equally important to technical skill development. The illuminators understood that their craft was fundamentally a form of prayer, a way of serving God through the creation of beauty that would inspire devotion in others. This spiritual dimension of their work infused every aspect of manuscript production with sacred purpose and helped sustain the artists through the long hours and demanding standards that their craft required. The economic impact of manuscript production extended throughout the region surrounding Saint-Denis, creating networks of suppliers, craftsmen, and merchants who served the Abbey's needs. The demand for high-quality parchment supported local specialists in hide preparation, while the need for exotic pigments created trade connections that stretched across Europe and into Asia and Africa. The Abbey's reputation for producing exceptional manuscripts also attracted wealthy patrons whose commissions provided resources for continued artistic development. The intellectual legacy of Saint-Denis illumination included significant contributions to the development of iconographic traditions and symbolic vocabularies that would influence Christian art for centuries. The specific ways that the Abbey's artists interpreted biblical narratives, depicted theological concepts, and integrated classical and Christian imagery became models that were copied and adapted throughout medieval Europe. These iconographic innovations represented genuine contributions to the visual culture of Christianity. The preservation of manuscripts at Saint-Denis required ongoing attention and resources, with the Abbey developing sophisticated methods for protecting completed works from the various threats that could destroy centuries of labor in moments. Fire, flood, warfare, and simple decay all posed risks to the accumulated treasury of illuminated manuscripts, requiring constant vigilance and periodic conservation efforts to ensure their continued survival. The copying of manuscripts for other institutions represented both an important source of income for the Abbey and a means of ensuring the wider distribution of important texts. When Brother Thomas worked on a manuscript that was destined for another monastery or cathedral school, he understood that he was participating in the broader mission of preserving and spreading Christian learning throughout Europe. Each copied manuscript multiplied the impact of the original while providing opportunities for artistic variation and innovation. The seasonal rhythms that governed manuscript production created natural patterns within the Abbey's yearly cycle, with different types of work being emphasized at different times of year. The winter months, when outdoor activities were limited and artificial lighting was most necessary, became peak periods for the finest illumination work. Spring brought opportunities for gathering plant materials and renewing supplies of organic pigments. Summer and autumn were times for major copying projects, and the completion of manuscripts began during the preceding months. The relationship between the scriptorium and the Abbey's other activities created integrated community life, where artistic production served the broader purposes of worship, education, and service to the surrounding region. The illuminated manuscripts used in the Abbey's own liturgical celebrations enhanced the beauty and solemnity of worship while providing practical tools for the conduct of services. The library manuscript supported the educational mission of the monastery while serving scholars and clerics from throughout the region. The influence of contemporary events on manuscript production created historical records that would provide future generations with insights into medieval life and thought. The illuminations reflected contemporary architectural styles, clothing fashions, social customs, and political arrangements while interpreting them through the lens of eternal spiritual truths. These historical elements embedded within sacred contexts created rich documents that served both religious and secular purposes. The collaborative relationships between different monastic communities created networks of artistic and intellectual exchange that enriched the work produced at each location. Brother Thomas corresponded with illuminators at other abbeys, sharing technical innovations and discussing interpretive approaches to common subjects. These relationships ensured that the best ideas and methods developed at any location would eventually spread throughout the broader community of manuscript producers. The patronage relationships that supported major manuscript projects created connections between the abbey and the wider world of medieval society. Royal commissions, episcopal requests, and private donations from wealthy individuals provided resources for ambitious projects while exposing the illuminators to different artistic traditions and cultural influences. These external relationships helped prevent the insularity that might otherwise have limited artistic development. As Brother Thomas worked through another afternoon in the familiar surroundings of the scriptorium, surrounded by the gentle sounds of fellow illuminators pursuing their patient craft, he understood that he was participating in something far greater than individual artistic expression. The manuscripts being created around him would carry forward not only the specific texts they contained, but also the values, skills, and spiritual insights of the community that produced them. The legacy of the Saint-Denis illuminators would be measured not only in the beauty of individual manuscripts, but in the countless lives that would be touched by their work across the centuries. Readers who would never know the names of the artists who created the books they studied would nonetheless be influenced by the care, skill, and devotion that went into every page. In this anonymous service to future generations lay both the humility and the grandeur of the illuminator's calling. The quiet revolution being carried out within the scriptorium, the preservation of learning, the advancement of artistic techniques, the integration of beauty and meaning represented one of the great achievements of medieval civilization. Through patient labor and faithful devotion, the illuminators of Saint-Denis were creating bridges across time that would connect their medieval world with readers in centuries they could not imagine, ensuring that the light of knowledge and beauty would continue to shine even through the darkest periods of human history. As evening prayers called the community together for the final time each day, Brother Thomas put aside his brushes and closed his pigment pots, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to participate in this great work of preservation and creation. The manuscripts he had worked on that day would outlive him, but they would also carry something of his devotion and skill into the future, making him part of the eternal conversation between human creativity and divine inspiration that defined the illuminated manuscripts of Saint-Denis. And so we return from our journey to the quiet halls of Saint-Denis, where time moved to the rhythm of prayer bells and the gentle scratch of quill on parchment. The illuminators we have visited, Brother Thomas and his countless unnamed colleagues, have long since laid down their brushes for the final time, but their legacy continues to glow with the same golden radiance they applied with such patient care so many centuries ago. In monastery libraries and museum collections around the world, the manuscripts of Saint-Denis still speak in their silent, beautiful language. The ultramarine blues still hold fragments of Afghan sky. The vermilion reds still pulse with the warmth of ancient fires. And the gold leaf still catches light, as it was meant to do when first applied by hands guided by faith and perfected by practice. These books remind us that true beauty is born not from haste or convenience, but from patient devotion to excellence. In our age of instant communication and digital reproduction, perhaps we need more than ever the example of these medieval craftsmen who understood that some things, the most important things, cannot be hurried. The illuminators of Saint-Denis sleep peacefully in their ancient graves, but their work continues. Every time someone opens an illuminated manuscript and feels that moment of wonder at the marriage of word and image, of meaning and beauty, The patient hands of those long-dead artists reach across the centuries to touch another human heart. In their quiet way, they achieved something approaching immortality not through fame or power, but through the simple act of creating beauty in service of something greater than themselves. As we drift towards sleep, perhaps we too can find in their example a gentle reminder that the most lasting achievements often come not with fanfare, but in the accumulated moments of careful devotion to work that truly matters.